And as we go past it, you're going to get this sensation. It's like a Dr. Seuss building. It's kind of wiggly, it curves, all three sections are going in and out. It's really an interesting shaped building. Super famous architect named Jeannie Gang. She has her own architecture firm here in Chicago. The penthouse, by the way, is still for sale, pre-construction, $17 million. I know a guy, you know in Chicago, yeah, I know a guy. I know a guy who's the lead structural engineer of this project, and last year I was up on the 5th floor when they were pouring the concrete, and learned all kinds of stuff about how you build tall buildings. Do you ever wonder, how do you build tall buildings in a windy city with sandy clay? 2 summers ago, $17 million. Now, it is designed by one of other Chicago Starchitects, a super famous guy named Adrian Smith. We call him the world's tallest architect because he builds the tallest buildings to flatter the context, contextualism. There's a simple French all blending together there. You know, in the early 1900s, the United States didn't yet know our own architectural style of beauty, so we were importing beauty, cutting and pasting from the tried and true European styling. Here's a nice photo for you right here to the right, right up above here. See if you can catch the flags in the foreground and the clock tower up there in the background. Tell them Jim sent you and they'll give you a free piece of chocolate. You know a guy. Around the corner to the left, the domed building is the Jeweler's Tower, also European classical Beaux-Arts style. Transformers movie, they filmed a lot of that up there. Now, the Jeweler's building was the center of the jewel trade in Chicago in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. You may have heard that Chicago had a little bit of a gangster problem back in the late 20s. And so you can imagine that diamond dealers didn't want to walk the dangerous streets of Chicago with a big old bag of jewels. So the dealers would drive their whole car into an elevator in the basement. The whole car would rise up to the floor where they're buying and selling their jewels, nice and smart. Gangster-proof, except up at the top, see the dome up there? The late 1920s, during Prohibition, liquor was illegal. There was one of those speakeasies. See a Greek temple. The name of the style, neoclassic. You take something classic like the Parthenon and you remake it with new materials, but preserve all the key proportions of the old style. You look up to the roof on the very top up there, you'll recognize that same proportion, the same pitch of the roof line throughout the whole Greco-Roman world. And so that's why it looks familiar, because it's the same proportion as the rest of those buildings. The same too with the columns, base shaft, because it's elevated and literally makes a loop in the center of the financial district. So those that work in the loop we call loopers. That might be on the test as well, loopers. And they're sitting here like these folks. Look at them cuddling together in the warm, in the cold here ever since. Over to the left, I just want to point out, the left part of the building was built in 1927, the right addition 1987. Notice how they use modern material and styling to complement the old. Here's another example of respecting the architectural heritage. See the bridge? Look at the lamps and handrails. This bridge is charming and vintage and old school and antique, except it's only 6 years old. It's an exact replica of the rusted 91-year-old bridge. That up. Stair-step setbacks. The building narrows towards the top. Telescoping towers. Polished Indiana limestone. Precision repetitive patterns. Arrows, diamonds, octagons, and decorative metal on the outside of the building. These buildings were made for a different generation. The late 1920s, the Roaring 20s. That was the jazz age, the decade of prosperity, luxury, airplane travel, sophistication. They wanted an architecture that explained the economy is good. So you'll see a whole bunch of Art Deco buildings were built in the late 20s because the stock market was up until it was down too. Maybe because this is where Ferris Bueller's dad worked in that iconic Chicago movie, Bueller. And it is a great example of how a building can conform to its context. The curve of the building matches the curve of the river. 2 different rows of reflective glass. Blue matches the sky, turquoise green matches the river water, and curved reflective glass makes the whole neighborhood look good. And that's the point, is to flatter the context. Contextualism. So not a bad context here. The building in front of us, an office tower, just opened a year too, doesn't it? But no, it is an actual office tower. And so here we are at what's called Wolf Point. And as they cut through those 4-foot thick walls to make the balconies and windows, they discovered the walls had been stuffed with matted horse hair. That's what they used as insulation. Over to your right in front of you, 1908 landmark bridge, only goes up and down once a year for maintenance, but it exposes how these Chicago-style bridges work. See the concrete? Think of a teeter-totter. Modernism, 1989, 4 river cottages. Now the architect Kerry Weiss was a sailor, so you can see some nautical themes in there. Now, what's interesting is when he made these in 1989, people thought this guy was kind of crazy, and it's not just for the unique shape of the building, but for having a house on the north branch of the Chicago River. Because the north branch was kind of the stinky, smelly industrial branch. Why would anyone want to live? For all its function. Why did they build a building like that? See these vents over here to your right? Between those red brick building, there was 6 Amtrak Metra train lines that go underneath that plaza there. And so the building was really wedged between train tracks on one side, river on the other. And so they kind of, to get office space, this was the way they had to do it. This cantilever leaning out over its base. Now, it's not going to fall. Oh, guys, it's not going to fall, but it is going to sway in the wind. Let me explain it. Imagine putting your feet together and see how the building, see how you can sway. Not very well. To compensate, this building's got 200,000 gallons of see a bridge open. Check this out. Now this is I didn't know they were starting this early, but in the spring and the fall, on Wednesdays and Saturdays, they'll open these bridges in a procession. You see, the sailboats can't get under the bridge, right? And so the way this works is a team open that bridge. See, these guys are happy because they're heading out to the lake for the summer to go sailing. I have a buddy, I know a guy who's got one of these sailboats, and I've done this procession with him a couple times. In fact, one time we were docked up right there, and there was a guy standing there. Over here to the left. Ooh, Benito. Over here to the left. What they're doing is they just tore down an old 5-story office building, and they are preparing for a new one. 3,600-seat opera, one of the biggest in the country. Now, this building was debuted in 1929, about a week before the stock market crashed. Now, remember, because of the stock market crash, the country goes into the Great Depression, followed by World War II. Guys, do you know that because of the Depression and World War II, there were practically no buildings, office buildings built across the country between 1930 and 1957. That's 27 years, a whole generation. Now, when they reboot architecture in the late 50s, they reboot it all the way down to its essential core, and this is what they get. It's all business. Straight lines and rational right angles. The building speaks for itself. This was a conservative time in U.S. history. These folks came back from the war after the Depression. That generation was busy. They were building the interstate system, AT&T, General Motors, General Electric, Ford, IBM. They didn't have time to sit around and argue about how many gargoyles to put on their office. Fitness center right next to each other. Kind of fun, huh? Corner Bakery's good, I knew that. Over here to the left, this is painted for you guys a couple summers ago. What is it? It's a giant "You Are Here" map. Yes, that orange Lego pieces up there is this building on the river. Now you look up there, you can see the Y shape of the river. Remember the symbol of Chicago, the circle with the Y in it? So if you get yourself lost, you can get straightened out there. The Joker's guys slid down on a zip line to the roof of this building. They went down and robbed Gotham Bank. At the end of the scene, the Joker, Heath Ledger, drives a school bus full of cash out through those windows and drives the wrong way, actually, down Van Buren Street, and that's how the Joker got away. It wasn't a bank that he robbed, it was a big empty post office. All this ugly concrete goes away. It's going to have a nice river walk and plazas down to the river. In fact, the entire roof of the building, 3-acre park by the time it's done, with grass and trees and all kinds of stuff. So it's going to be nice once it's done. So let's tell some stories. You guys like story time? Once upon a time kind of stories? Let's tell 3 stories that much worse, and it burned out 4 square miles of the center of the city. Biggest urban fire in history. Those are the facts. Now the fiction's a little more playful, comes in with how did the fire start? Well, in the end, over 22 years after the fire destroyed the city, Chicago had rebuilt itself well enough to be able to host the World's Fair of 1893. That's a pretty good comeback. These cars that each held 61 passengers. That's 2,100 passengers. Amazing, yeah? And a lot of people came to that fair. 26 million people came through the turnstiles of that fair during 6 months. Now, half of those people had come from outside the United States. Now, think about it. They came and they saw this beautiful white city. And then the king right behind it, tall, dark, and handsome, you can't miss it, the Willis Tower. or if you're from Chicago, the Sears Tower. 1974, Sears department store builds the tallest building in the world in the Windy City. 50 floors, 2 columns go to 66 floors, 3 columns go to 90, only 2 of the 9 columns go all the way to 110 floors. Now, if you look up on the left side, up on the sky deck, you're going to see 4 glass rooms sticking out from the sky deck, and you'll see brave people have walked out onto a glass ledge and are looking down through their feet at you and taking Esky Park and Marshall Field. So you're going to hear it go both ways. The Sears Tower is the Willis Tower. Here's a nice view right there. Sears Tower is the Willis Tower, or the Swillis Tower. Now, some Chicagoans would say it's just a pronunciation. Up here to the right, the 2 towers, 1982. These 2 towers were built leaning away from each other, 1/8 of an inch per floor, having calculated that when the weight of the 2-story atrium was hung between them, it pulled those 2 towers straight up and down, which it did. Amazing. Also notice, see the zigzag corners? Form follows function. One of the reasons is to give the building more corner offices. Important people like to have a corner office. Dominated for 37 years now, amenities of a big city. But it's a city of neighborhoods, 77 fascinating neighborhoods. If you get a chance, guys, I recommend you get out of downtown and go see some neighborhoods. We're coming back into Wolf Point, and we're going to see again more clearly the Y shape of the river. Remember, we went up the North Branch. We're coming up the South Branch here. Remember the symbol of Chicago, the circle with the Y in it? A couple of years. This whole intersection will have changed. By the way, see that Holiday Inn up there to the left? There is a bar up there called Cityscape, and it has outstanding views of the river here. If you get a chance, go up there. Okay, the merchandise mart in front of us, we talked about it for its Art Deco size. Or for its style. Now let's talk about it for its size, because this in 1930 was the largest building in the world. How big? 25 floors, 36 elevators, 96 acres of floor space. That's 73 football fields of floor space. 7.5 miles of corridor. Its own zip code, 2 city blocks, and its own police force and fire department. It's a big, big building. They're mostly converted to offices for burgeoning e-commerce businesses here in Chicago, although they do have a big merchandise show every year. As the metal shrinks, the gap gets bigger. The hotter it is, the metal expands. When they get over about 102 degrees, some of these bridge sections can pinch each other. They've had to call in the fire department to spray down the metal to cool it off so that it'll shrink. Deco building, 1929. That is real gold leaf on the top there. Now, it was built in 1929 in the middle of Prohibition. Some say the building was meant to look like a giant champagne bottle. So, you know, it kind of does with the big foil there. State Street, that great street deco with the green building. Right behind it, Black Box Modernism. 2 behind that, the International style, the boxy concrete buildings. And then the pointy building there. The style is called Echo Deco. It's kind of imitating the Chrysler building in New York City. Crowded and crowding and aggressive. I think that space makes a difference. Who knows? Straight up over here to the left, the Chicago Tribune Tower, as you can imagine, modeled after a French Gothic cathedral, complete with flying buttresses, those upside down L's that look like little bridges supporting the center tower. The gap between the buildings here, you're going to see a quick glimpse of, there it is, of the Hancock Tower. Now the Hancock, though it's the 4th tallest in the city, it sort of stands out because it's got the 2 big white antenna. It's a black trapezoid, wider at the bottom, relatively far apart those concrete columns are, and 2, how relatively thin the concrete floor pads are. Cracking off, but what's more, because it's stiffer and stronger, you can now take the floor plate and make it about 1/3 thinner than previously. That's 1/3 the material cost and the weight. 1/3, you know, you can maybe go 1/3 taller, 1/3 the cost. Just to take your pictures, and because we're in Chicago and people are friendly, let's help each other with photos, right? Instead of watching people take selfies, you can step in, you take one of them,